Welcome to the Surviving to Thriving podcast with Jim Squire. I'm a licensed psychotherapist here in Toronto, Canada. And the title of this episode is Childhood Trauma, What It Actually Looks Like. When most people think about trauma, they think about something dramatic, one terrible event. And certainly that can be part of it. But in most cases, what it is repeated experiences over many years during their developmental period. Most of what walks into my office doesn't look like that. What it looks like is, I don't know why I react this way. I don't know why I can't trust people. I don't know why I go numb when someone's kind to me, or why I always feel that the other shoe is going to drop, even though there's objectively no reason to think that. And I want you to remember the phrase, I don't know, because that's going to be prominent in this episode. Childhood trauma, in an actual way, looks more like a quiet, relational, everyday version where the child is trying to connect, the child is trying to move through experiences, and the parent is reacting through stress, frustration, unable to cope, unable to regulate themselves, and inadvertently is yelling or avoiding or neglecting or abandoning the child in some way. So trauma isn't about the size of the event on some external scale. It's about whether a child's nervous system and coping capacity, and this would be true for anyone, even adults, was overwhelmed. Repeatedly over time in a developmentally brain that didn't yet have the tools to make sense of what was happening. Childhood trauma is usually relational and repeated. Things like inconsistent caregiving, emotional neglect, unpredictable households, a parent who is frightening or simply unavailable. This is the territory of what we call complex PTSD, trauma that happens developmentally inside relationships that were supposed to be safe. So most people are familiar with the term PTSD, which is more something we apply to adults who receive some trauma through a single event, a car accident, something where they were robbed or mugged, something like that. With complex PTSD, there are many incidents over many years, most of which isn't even remembered, but those together create a pattern, which is where the problem comes from. CPTSD specifically involves harm that's repeated, begins during identity-forming years. It comes from people, this is very important, comes from people who are supposed to provide safety, which is why it reaches into identity and deeper levels of self. And it's not just about symptoms. It's about the core of who the person is generally. And this is why it's difficult sometimes, especially with people not having the memory of these incidents or memory much of their childhood. There's no single scene to point to. But as I said, there's a pattern. So let's talk a bit about what this looks like. So let's start with what most people expect to hear, fear. Fear is certainly part of trauma. It's fast, it's meaning-making, it's a survival reflex. Everyone's familiar with being frightened or scared, a slammed door, raised voice, a single frightening event. The nervous system responds before the thinking brain even has a chance to. That's true for a child, it's also true for an adult. Fear doesn't wait for a story. So for trauma that comes from a discrete, identifiable event, an assault, an incident, a frightening episode with a caregiver, fear is often the first thing that shows up, and it shows up immediately. But most of what I see in the room in my sessions isn't that kind of fear-driven. It's chronic, it's relational, and in that kind of trauma, there's often a clear danger cue to respond to, because the source of danger is also the source of safety. The same parent who's frightening tonight is the one who needs to feed you tomorrow. And that's a different kind of problem for the nervous system to solve. You can't just run away from it, you can't avoid it, you can't just brace against it, because you also depend on it. So instead of a clear fear response, what develops is confusion. Holding two irreconcilable things at the same time. This person loves me and this person just hurt me and not being able to resolve them. This is the core distinction for today. Acute identifiable danger tends to produce fear first. Chronic relational harm tends to produce confusion because there's no safe direction to run, and it doesn't, let's face it, doesn't make sense to the child. So now the other main component that most people are familiar with, which is the one that shows up a lot if you're interacting with people that have had childhood trauma, is shame. Shame is not an immediate reaction the way fear is. Shame requires a story. It requires the mind to have already attached meaning to what happened. A child in danger doesn't feel shame in that moment. They feel fear, or in a relational trauma, confusion. Shame shows up after, once the mind starts asking, why did this happen? And the mind needs some type of answer. Here's the bind the child ends up in. A child is dependent fully on their caregiver for survival. So the answer is, if this person I depend on is unsafe, unlivable, there's nowhere else to go. So the mind resolves it differently. It's safer developmentally to conclude I'm the problem as the child, and the person keeping me alive isn't the problem. That meaning that gets attached, that's where shame is born. So if I'm broken, flawed, inadequate, or the problem, in a bigger context, it can feel solvable because, for example, if I'm being told I'm a bad boy, I could try to be better, be good. If my caregiver is unable to manage our life together in some way, that's unsolvable for a child and terrifying, frankly, because how are they going to survive? So the original response was fear or confusion. Once the nervous system needs an explanation, self-blame is often the explanation it lands on because it offers a strange kind of control. If it's my fault, I can fix it, rather than the helplessness of admitting the situation was never in the child's control at all, which would be terrifying. So the sequence, more precisely, fear or confusion comes first immediately as the nervous system's raw response. Shame comes second after there's an processing. I will say that with adults who've had chronic experiences of shame, shame will show up fairly quickly. The adult doesn't need to sort of process to find the shame. The shame would just come up fairly quickly and it would be rooted in something like this childhood trauma's experiences. But when we're looking at a young child, 5 or 6 years old, that's where a lot of the confusion comes from, because they're just trying to show their parent a picture that they created, and they're trying to ask them a question about something, and then all of a sudden there's this anger, this yelling, this criticism, go to your room, stop bothering me, something like that. And the child is legitimately confused, of course, because it isn't about the child. That is about the parent, generally the parent's ability to emotionally regulate. It's about their issues with stress and all the other things they're trying to manage. So, of course, it generally has nothing to do with the child. Even if a child does something like break something, run around the house, act up in some way, they are really just being a child and doing what comes natural to them. So, of course, they're also going to be confused around, like, I was just laughing with my friends, or I was just playing, or I just thought I would run to the washroom in the restaurant. That seemed like fun. And then when they get in trouble, especially when they're quite young, there's confusion. So how does this show up in adult life? Relationally, difficulty trusting, feeling safe with people, over-explaining themselves, generally because you can't cope with I'm the problem. Scanning a partner's moods for danger. Is everything okay? Pulling away when things get intense or close because vulnerability doesn't feel safe. Emotionally, not knowing what you feel or feeling everything at once with no clear source. A persistent low-grade sense that something's always wrong. Like I said before, always feeling the other shoe is going to drop. One of the things that when people go through therapy and they start to get better and their body starts to change and their mind starts to change and they respond to events differently is they start getting confused because things start going well in their life and they don't have any of these problems. And so then that starts feeling very strange, out of their comfort zone, because they're not used to it. The research on childhood trauma and adult attachment consistently links early trauma to more insecure attachment styles, whether it's avoidant or anxious, which in predicts, of course, lower relational satisfaction. Anyone that's been in relationships with people that are either avoidant or anxious knows that it's very difficult to be in a relationship with them. And a lot of people, quite honestly, won't continue in that relationship because it seems like it's too taxing. So even the physical, the somatic, you've got chronic tension, you've got gut issues, you've got fatigue. A lot of my clients have autoimmune disorders. There's the bracing. Often, even when they're trying to rest, the body is kind of on this alert, hypervigilant sort of edge, which is creating, of course, leads to this chronic tension. But whether the original response was fear or confusion, the body often ends up holding what the mind couldn't fully resolve. And that's where a lot of the work in therapy comes from, working through getting out a lot of this stuff, as we call unburdening yourself from a lot of these trapped, stored feelings, and which is often buried. So in terms of the different approaches that work, I'm going to sort of talk a bit about the area that I work. There are people that still use talk therapy for trauma. I used to, like many years ago. I don't anymore. A lot of people are using more somatic approaches. Your body often holds the story, as we say. So in other words, if I get someone to focus on a trigger, they'll say, oh, my chest gets really tense, or my jaw, or I notice this, my shoulders get tight, whatever it is, that's connected to, and in most cases that is directly the experience the child would have had back when the childhood wound was being formed. So there's a lot of information the body's giving us. Most people don't think about that. They think about like what's going on or what happened or something, but if we can go into the body, it's a lot more beneficial. So somatic work isn't about talking about what happened. It's about helping the nervous system complete responses you never got to finish, and feeling safer in your body and getting out of that sort of fight or flight or fawn or freeze response. So internal family systems is another approach I use. This primarily with my clients. And it's been such a shift in my practice. We're looking at a lot of these, experiences that happen, how they show up in the body, where you're feeling them. And then we're looking at our protective systems, these parts of ourselves that we developed to keep us safe. The things that you wouldn't even necessarily think of that serve a purpose, like my anger. My anger could serve a purpose to keep people away from me, to stop people from trying to take advantage of me, something like that. Anger is very powerful. I get a lot of energy from it. It might feel good to be angry. Being avoided, procrastinating. We look at these as all protective mechanisms that keep you from triggering your deeper wounds. Being confused, being, distracted, having things like disassociation or something that are very sort of adaptive responses that keep you fulfilling the full effect of what's actually happening, and certainly very common when we look at childhood trauma. Even part of as we talked about earlier, like blaming yourself feels more survivable than blaming someone you depend on. I guess even in a relationship context as an adult, you could think that I'm the problem in the relationship with my partner feels more solvable than my partner is the problem, or how we relate to each other as people is the problem. And so how do I fix that? There's parts of you that go numb and shut down. Those are very protective. They keep you from being in conversations. They keep you from being vulnerable, maybe having to talk about something that's difficult. The problem with people when they look at these situations, they think, well, this is not helpful for me. But you have to look at a lot of these responses as immediate in the moment to avoid something like the system becoming overwhelmed and triggered on a deeper level. So in the moment, shutting down gets me out of the conversation in the bigger context, my partner could get fed up with me and not want to be in a relationship with me. But your system is not looking at the bigger picture in that moment. It's a very immediate response to just protect the system from being emotional, overwhelmed, or triggered in some way. The other thing we look at with IFS is all of these parts serve a purpose. We need to learn to love and accept and understand all our parts instead of like most people do, which is, these are the parts of me I like. These are the parts I don't like. I wish I could get rid of my anger, rid of my anxiety, rid of my, that part of me that can't be vulnerable. And that's not how it works. We need to learn how to love and accept all of ourselves, not just the parts that we like. And that would be a core kind of like phrase that would encapsulate the work we're doing with IFS. So EMDR is another very common, very, very well documented way of working with trauma. I do not use it, but I will still explain a bit about it. So whereas somatic or IFS help people understand and relate differently to their parts, EMDR works more directly in how the traumatic memory is stored, helping the brain reprocess and experience so that it stops firing in the present the way it did originally. It's evidence-based, and it's effective for people that may not even meet the full criteria of PTSD, but are still carrying a lot of this reactivity related to what happened. Why does all this matter, and what does recovery look like? So just to reiterate, you don't need the worst story to have this. Most people really don't even remember much about their childhood, quite honestly. In some cases, childhood trauma is often invisible because there's rarely one incident to point to, and it's just a long adaptation to something that never quite made sense. A lot of what I would do, the work I do, isn't necessarily even considered trauma, but it's very difficult for the child, and it has lingering effects on how people function as an adult, which is the reason why they're working on it. Recovery isn't about erasing the past, it's about being able to cope with, generally the memory is going to be there, but the memory is not going to be, have this emotional reactivity attached to it. So if I think back to an incident, I can think, oh, that was a terrible incident. But I don't feel this powerful, overwhelming emotion that comes from that. And the same thing would be that these particular older wounds or these incidents that happen in childhood will then trigger me as an adult. I'll get triggered as an adult. We would notice that would go down. That would start minimizing to quite a big degree. So you can cope, you can manage, you can breathe, you can reframe or try a different approach sometimes. Most people who come to see me tell me that the reactions are so immediate and so fast, they have no ability to control or manage them. So really, trauma is kind of, the opposite of safety. So everyone really wants to be calm, peaceful, feel safe. That's how we function best in relationships or in ourself and in the world. And the trauma is the opposite of that. It's like you're in this kind of protective, really hyper alert, protective state, and safety is absent in some cases, especially when you were young. So most people really get confused about this. Even when I work with partners in couples therapy, they think, well, my partner knows I would never harm them. But the problem is when you get upset and you start yelling and you're twice the size of your partner, and you start acting irrational, their system is going to light up and not going to think, oh, he'll never hurt me. No, their system is going to be full of fear and overwhelmed because of that. Your survival mechanism will take over. So we have to realize that part of what we're trying to do is help people feel safe in their bodies, in the world, in their relationships, etc. And that takes a bit of work if predominantly their childhood didn't have very much safety in it. If they were always on alert, always hypervigilant, always scanning for threats, unless you've done some work on yourself, that's going to carry right through to being an adult. And we might label that differently. We might say, oh, I'm just anxious a lot, or I'm not a trusting person. But there's deeper reasons for that. So most people that experience this kind of trauma do, get help, go on to live a full, meaningful life. Some people go through therapy. Some people find other avenues to work through things. But with the right support, it isn't a life sentence. It's a pattern that can be understood and can be shifted. And I like to use the word healing. We do healing in these sessions. And people are finding themselves free of a lot of this stuff that really plagued them for most of their life. And I think in most cases, they didn't think they could ever move past. So if you want to take one thing from this episode, I'd like you to really think about maybe one prominent childhood memory you had, a clear moment of fear, or maybe it was something harder to name, or maybe think back to like the confusion that came. And then maybe help you relate to what I'm talking about. Everyone's had incidents where they were like caught off guard, blindsided, confused. I mean, I wanted to play with a bunch of kids in the schoolyard, and I ran up to them saying, "Hey, can I play?" And they said, "No, get away from us. We don't want to play with you." So those kind of things are confusing. They're hurtful. They're overwhelming. By kind of relating to some of your own experiences, it might help you kind of get more out of this session. If this is something you're struggling with, by all means, go through to our website, www.traumatherapist.ca, and there's a lot of information there. And you can even meet with me individually and set up a consult, and we can talk about your particular situation. If you have any comments or suggestions for the podcast, I'd love to hear them. Just reach out through social media or through the other channels where you find the podcast and make some suggestions, comments. Until then, take care.